Hello and welcome to our new arrangement of webinars. This is a series of interviews put on jointly by the Forum of Christian Leaders and the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, your host, the CEO of ICMDA. And tonight we're looking at the question of can we trust the Gospels? And I'll be interviewing Dr. Peter J. Williams about his recent book under that same title. We're going to explore how well the evidence for Jesus compares with the writings we have about famous people in history. We're going to see that the writers of the four Gospels were deeply familiar with the land and culture they wrote about. We'll see that we can test the Gospels for reliability in many different ways and that they pass the test. We're also going to look at some of the common objections to the Gospels being true. So our interviewee today is Dr. Peter J. Williams, who's the principal and CEO of Tyndale College in Cambridge. Hi, Peter. Great to have you on the program.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Great to be here.
Peter was educated at the University of Cambridge, where he received his MA, MPhil and PhD in the study of ancient languages related to the Bible. And after his PhD, he was on staff in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge back in the late 1990s, and thereafter he taught Hebrew and also Old Testament as an affiliated lecturer in Hebrew and Aramaic at the University of Cambridge and a research fellow in Old Testament at Tyndale House. From 2003 to 2007, you were on the faculty of the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where you became a senior lecturer in New Testament and deputy head of the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy. And since 2007, so nearly 20 years now, you've been leading Tyndale House at Cambridge. You're also an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity in the University of Cambridge and a member of the Translation Oversight Committee of the English Standard Version of the Bible. And your book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which we're going to focus on tonight, has been translated into 12 languages. So we're really looking forward to this. I have to confess, Peter, that I had not read your book until last weekend, but I read it on Sunday, and it was a really clear and easy read, and I'd really thoroughly recommend it. And we're going to follow the book's contents pretty much with the questions, but then bring in some supplementaries as well. So, Peter, I wanted to start just by asking you why you wrote this book, Can We Trust the Gospels, and what specific audience did you have in mind when you put it together? There's a lot of material on this subject and a lot of much, much longer books than this one.
Yeah, so I thought about writing this for 20 years and planned it in my head. And it takes 4 hours to read. When my daughter read it, she said, "Dad, this is just all your talks put together," which is there's some truth to. So I practiced it on many live audiences before I wrote it, and I think that helped mature the material. My target audience was engineers and non-Christian family. So engineers, because they like things that work, they want to know how things work, they like evidence. And so I aimed at that to try and make sure it wasn't a sort of waffly conceptual book, but was really giving people concrete evidence exactly where they can find any particular manuscript I reference or check any fact I talk about.
And I note you use the word trust. It's can we trust the Gospels rather than can we believe the Gospels, which one might have expected. Why have you chosen that word for a purpose?
Well, I was really, the contrast was not belief, but proof. I think a lot of people are talking in terms of proof, which can be very, very confusing. Because it's used differently by lawyers, by philosophers, by mathematicians, by scientists. And I'm looking more at the practical fact that every day we trust people. We trust people for our food. We trust doctors and all sorts of folk. And what's that based on? And really applying that to the Gospels.
Okay, well, that makes good sense. And I believe that the word translated faith or trust or faith or belief is a better translation of it as trust, isn't it, rather than just academic belief, if you like.
Well, yes, the word faith in the public sphere now tends to mean belief without evidence. It's or an irrational belief.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be what the Bible's talking about. Let's say when it gives you the narrative of Abraham, God shows himself to Abraham and gives him evidence and then calls forth future trust based on that.
Yeah.
So it's not the same as proof, but it's also not the same as irrational belief.
Okay. So often the first question you get from a non-Christian skeptic is show me evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus even existed, because this deep skepticism. So what do contemporary non-Christian sources tell us about Jesus, and how do they affirm or deny the reliability of the Gospels?
Well, I just use three, namely Tacitus, Pliny, and one out of two texts by Josephus.
Yeah.
There's been a recent book written by Thomas C. Schmidt, which also argues for the validity of the other text from Josephus, which has been quite disputed. But for me, the picture that's shown is that Christianity spreads far and fast, and that it's very hard for Christians in the early stage. That's the picture you get from Tacitus, who talks about the Christians being blamed for the Great Fire in Rome in the year 64. Yeah. Already that implies the name Christ. He talks about Christus, the Latin word equivalent to Greek Christos. So Christianity has spread all the way to Rome within 30 years of beginning, and there are large numbers of followers. And then Pliny is writing to the emperor in the early 2nd century, but talking about Christians he has interviewed or interrogated and what they describe as going on in a Christian meeting, and seems to have been going on for a long time. So, and from that, you can establish early Christians treating Christ as God. From the text in Josephus, you can establish the fact that Jesus has a brother called James, who's prepared to die for his belief. And that's actually going on in Jerusalem. So there are various things that you can establish. But of course, the majority of early material about Jesus is by Jesus enthusiasts, and that shouldn't surprise us.
No, that's exactly what you'd expect. Just tell us a little bit more about who Tacitus, Pliny, and Josephus were, and how well known they are as historians in their own right.
Well, Tacitus is a big dude, and some people would see him as the best of the Roman historians. A bit cynical. He writes his annals, and he's actually a child in Rome at the time of the Great Fire. People trust him for things that happened a long, long time earlier, and so that is generally thought to be a reliable account, despite his sort of cynicism. Pliny is writing to the emperor. He's a governor of a particular area in Turkey. And then Josephus began as a Jewish commander in the war against the Romans, and then flipped sides to join the Romans, and then became a historian sponsored by the emperor.
Yeah. Now, of course, there are four Gospels, but by four different authors, but three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, have very similar content.
Yep.
While John reads very, very differently from that. What are the key differences between the Gospels, and why are they so different? In particular, why are the Synoptics so different from John?
Yeah, so I don't think the question, why are the Synoptics different from John, is the way I would approach it. The striking phenomenon is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar. What I mean by that is, if you take, say, Plato and Xenophon talking about Socrates, they are really quite different. If you take the different accounts there are of Alexander the Great, or different accounts there are of Tiberius, the emperor, they are very, very different. So I would say, if you like, the distance between Matthew and John is just a normal distance, right? The thing that's unusual is the closeness of Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Sure.
And what that means is there is some way in which either they have to come from a common tradition, let's call it a syllabus early on in the church, or as some people think, Mark came first, and then there's a source that explains common material in Matthew and Luke. But what I'd say is actually the arrangement is optimal, because if you hypothetically thought that there were 4 Gospels, and we'll call one big A, capital A, and one small a, and one big B, and one small b, and small a came from big A, and small b came from big B, you would only have 2 sources.
Mm.
Or if you just had A, B, C, D, and they had no relationship, you wouldn't really be able to test anything. But what we get with the Gospels is at least 6 major types of material, because we get things unique to Matthew, things unique to Luke, things only in Mark. We get a triple overlap, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We get things that are Matthew and Luke in common. But then we also get these minor aspects where Matthew and John go together, or Mark and John go together, or Luke and John go together. So Mary and Martha are only in Luke and John. Only Matthew and John have Jesus referring to his disciples at the time of his resurrection as his brothers. So you get these tiny agreements across, and that just gives you an amazing wealth of material. And I've never tried to show it mathematically, but I think it may be a sort of almost mathematically optimal way of getting the most material you can analyze out of just 4 books.
Now, a question that Muslims often bring up is that they say that the whole theology develops as you go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that the earlier Gospels portray Jesus very much as a man, but once we get to John, he's assumed divine proportions. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, let's imagine we go with the view that Mark is the earliest Gospel. Already in chapter 2, Jesus is forgiving sins, and people are saying, oh, only God can do that. He is saying the Son of Man, that's himself, is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, I mean, like, isn't God in charge of the Sabbath? How can the Son of Man be in charge of the Sabbath that God started? And then you go on, he's walking on the water, which only God does. He healing the blind, which only God does. And you go through, and the question is, like, who is this? And I think that what it's doing is it's teaching you to work something out. So we know that questions are a very good way of teaching, because it makes the listener do more work than if you just give a statement. And it seems that Mark is raising the question, can you work out who this is? And you therefore come to a stronger conclusion at the end. Also, he talks about the Son of Man has come. Very common expression. He's come from elsewhere. He's come from outside the world. So I think the idea in Mark's Gospel very clearly is that Christ exists before he came to this planet. And so that's a very strong thing you could say. And of course, the centurion concludes he's the Son of God. So I think you can make a strong argument that Mark has a very high view of who Jesus is. And then we can do the same with Matthew and Luke, and that in fact they're treating him as God himself. And the fact that there isn't an explicit statement doesn't really concern me, because a theme you have in Mark's Gospel constantly is secrecy. It's sometimes called the messianic secret. Yes. Jesus does a miracle and then tells people not to tell anyone. So very clearly he's playing down publicity for himself.
Right. Until the timing is right, I guess. Yeah. So Matthew and John, of course, were both members of the 12 disciples, weren't they? Luke and Mark were not. Does the fact that those 2 Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses devalue them in any way as historic records?
Well, I mean, of course, we regularly follow news reports which are not by eyewitnesses but are written by people who've investigated things.
Yeah.
So Luke clearly says he's investigated. There's good reason to think that he's talked to Mary, possibly Elizabeth. He's talked to disciples. He's traced things up in the Holy Land and so on. Mark is traditionally thought to be Peter's interpreter, which means that effectively it's a bit like Christopher Tolkien writing up J.R.R. Tolkien's work. There's a very, very close relationship there. And so I think that we have a lot of eyewitness material from Peter coming over. And you see that, for instance, in the way that Mark will describe the Sea of Galilee very much from a fisherman's perspective on the shoreline. We tend to look at the Sea of Galilee now on a map from a satellite or Google Earth or something like that from the sky. And so that's what we decide looks like the other side. But you'll find the way that Mark is using the other side is very much a shoreline view. And that's the sort of thing that we expect when there's careful recording of what an eyewitness has said.
Yeah. Now, getting back to similarities between the Gospels, and there are parts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, which almost run word for word identical to each other. To what extent did they copy each other? To what extent did they draw on similar material? Is there another Gospel composition called Q or not? Address these questions.
So in scholarship, the letter Q, which is an abbreviation for the German word Quelle, meaning source, is used as an abbreviation for the material common to Matthew and Luke. And it's a very common view that Mark comes first and Matthew and Luke have access to Mark, but they also have access to this source, which we could call Q.
Yeah.
And there's debate about whether it's in Aramaic or in Greek, and whether it's a written source or some other sort of source. But the key thing to note is that's no one's found this document, and there are some challenges to the idea, particularly because you have to suppose that something was widespread enough to be used by Matthew and Luke in the different places where they were, and then to disappear off the face of the planet. And some people who are not evangelicals have challenged this Q idea. There's a Professor Mark Goodacre at Duke University, for instance, and others. I've written my book, so it is agnostic about this. So, and that's very deliberate, because I think that the case for the reliability of the Gospels doesn't need to depend on what order I think the Gospels were written in, or what dates they were written. The thing is, with the tragic events in Australia on Sunday or Saturday night, already lies were spreading and within hours. And I saw some of those. And so you could have lies spread in a very short time, but you can also have truth preserved over decades or even centuries. So the Gospels are close enough to the events to be true and far enough away from the events to be false. Those are both possibilities. You then have to look at them to see which type of material they are. And I think you can make lots of arguments from them that they are trustworthy and reliable. But it's not really about the date. I like to say my granny is 105, and I can get, she's really getting on quite a bit, but I can get stories from her from long, long ago. And so that's where I think that simply the question of the date of the Gospels is not relevant. The Gospels do not come with dates on, they do come with names on: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I would say that's where I get excited about the names, not about the dates.
Yeah, no, I think that argument about a generational memory is a very powerful one. My grandfather observed Halley's Comet in 1910.
Right.
That's 115 years ago, when he was a little boy of 6. and he told me and his other grandchildren about it. So it's quite an amazing span.
They're
That's
fabulous.
a long time in human memory. But can I just come back to the dates a little bit? How reliably can we ascertain the composition dates of the Gospels, and to what extent does that, impact upon their historical reliability? Because some people will argue that they weren't written until very late, perhaps even in the 2nd century.
Yeah, so what we've got is lots and lots of documents as you go through time. So we could work back from the 4th century, the 3rd century, the 2nd century, and there's sort of lots of literature. And what you find is once something's been written, it starts influencing other literature. So you can look at, say, early 2nd century writers, and they seem to know different bits from the Gospels. Or you could even say that 1 Timothy 5, verse 18, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, is a reference to Luke chapter 10 and verse 7. But what would happen is let's say you could debate whether the early 2nd century literature is actually genuine, but then you're going to have a problem with the literature just after that quotes things. So you end up having a sort of log jam or something. So I think any attempt to sort of push the Gospels really late into the early 2nd century becomes problematic. And you have to ask the question, why is someone doing this as a sort of intellectual exercise to see how late I can push a document? And the other thing is, I'd say the Gospels in their material appear to be 1st generation documents. And so they certainly seem to know about the layout of Jerusalem before the destruction of the year 70 by the Romans. We got to remember that the Gospels are very Jewish, all 4 of them, in their knowledge, and yet we know that Jews were driven from the land after the Roman war, and the Gospels seem to be reflecting the time before that. So I would say it doesn't make a lot of sense to be pushing the Gospels to a very late date, and then also you have to explain how they spread. So I think that that they are as a 1st century documents, but also 1st generation documents. So if, let's say, Matthew was a tax collector before he met Jesus around the year 27 or 30 or whenever, then you imagine he has a normal lifespan, then it's not being written in the year 80 or 90. Now, there is a tradition about John having lived a particularly long time, and so you could have his gospel written later, and that wouldn't be a problem. But if Luke was a doctor and then accompanied Paul, and we know life expectancy on the whole is not that long, it just doesn't make that much sense to be pushing the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, into the last couple of decades of the 1st century.
Yeah, or even after the fall of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got a fascinating chapter in this book called "Did the Gospel Writers Know Their Stuff?" and on how geographical references and personal names affirm the Gospels as 1st century documents. I wonder, could you unpack that a bit for us? Talk a bit about the geography and the names of people that we see.
Yeah, so I mean, the top geographer in the Roman era was really Strabo. And he wrote lots of geography, but also he got confused between the Dead Sea and a lake in Egypt. And this is such a huge blunder because it's really easy to get stuff wrong when you've not been to a place and there's no internet.
Yeah.
And so the fact that we have the gospel writers not just naming villages, but also knowing when to use the verb he went up, when to use the verb he went down.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary stuff. It's giving you knowledge of topography. And then having the tax collectors in the right place, the right dry measurements that they use, the right customs. This is all significant stuff. Very easy, of course, for a local to get right. Now, So I think we can make the case that the gospel writers are using information, are either locals or have had very close interviews with locals. I think those are the two possibilities, and they're at least geographically close enough to get the material right, the stories right.
How does it contrast with what we might call the apocryphal gospels written later in terms of the geographical detail? What's the comparison like?
Well, with the Gospel of Thomas, which is probably the earliest of these apocryphal gospels that we have.
What date was that?
Well, people come up with the year 140, but it's not an exact number. Okay, but the key thing is the Gospel of Thomas doesn't seem to know or care where Jesus was. He simply comes out with 114 sayings.
Yeah.
And you read it and you're wondering, well, was he on a mountain? Was he in heaven? Where was he? You just don't know. And it doesn't seem to care. And it doesn't really mention any of the sort of narrative geography that we might expect in a gospel. And other gospels are similar, possible exception of the Gospel of Peter, which is a little bit dependent on our full gospels. But generally they don't seem to have that sort of stuff right.
Yeah, no, amazing. I visited the Holy Land twice, and it's extraordinary the way it transforms your Bible reading, because you cannot read the narrative passages without seeing the places and imagining where you are. And we get that detail, don't we? Can we come back to names as well, Peter? And how do the names of people that we see in the Gospels match with what we know historically were particularly the popular Jewish or other names at the time?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got 4 places where we know quite a bit about Jewish names. So we've got the catacombs in Rome, where typically Jews have some quite Roman, some quite Latin names. We've got quite a number of names from Egypt, where there's a large Jewish community in Alexandria. We also have Jewish names from Turkey. And then if you look at the Holy Land, then we have names from there. And what we find is that the names of the characters in the Gospels are right for the land. And I mean, at a sort of broad level, the most important or common name for a Jewish male is Simon, and for a female, Mary. And this is both outside the Gospels and inside. And I think you find other things happening, like with the more common names, they are more likely in the full Gospels to get a disambiguator on them. So Simon of Cyrene, Simon the leper, and so on, Mary Magdalene. And that's not happening with the less common names.
Yeah.
And it even happens with the name Jesus, which is about the 6th most common name at the time, where in the narrative, there's often effort to disambiguate Jesus, or when people speak about him in a crowd setting.
Yeah, he's often referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, isn't he?
Yeah.
Distinguish him from the other Jesuses at the time. So tell us a bit too about how you make reference to finance and botany as well. How does that authenticate what we're reading?
Well, again, when you just have something like a reference to the Mount of Olives, and there are still olive trees there, it shows someone knows what plants are in a particular area, but also, because it's not that big a hill, and that they can find palm branches for the triumphal entry, or that there is a ficus sycomoros in Jericho, where Jericho has a completely different climate from Jerusalem because it's so much lower. It's the lowest city on the planet. And then where the tax collectors are, in Luke, they are in Jericho. At least that's where you have a chief tax collector, Zacchaeus. So you've got other tax collectors implicitly around there. In Matthew and Mark, you find collections of tax collectors round in Capernaum, which is just at the top of the Sea of Galilee. Is exactly the right places in terms of Roman roads and travel to put toll collectors. And so it's just these sorts of details that the Gospels know.
Yeah, coming to the manuscripts now, what are the main manuscripts that we rely on for the Gospels, and when were they written? And perhaps start by talking about the Textus Receptus, what Erasmus
Sure.
originally used to compose his Greek New Testament.
So just over 500 years ago, Erasmus, who was a very clever guy as well as a good publicist, produced a Greek New Testament, not far behind me in Queen's College in Cambridge. He did some of the work, and he has manuscripts numbers 1 and 2 for the Gospels,
Okay.
and they are late medieval 12th century manuscripts onwards, and that's what he has. We now have complete manuscripts of the Gospels going back to the 4th century, and fragmentary but also extensive manuscripts 3rd century and smaller bits in the 2nd century. But also we have translations into lots of languages that Erasmus didn't have, like Syriac and Coptic and so on. And so what it means is there's just a wealth of evidence that you can trace with the Gospels to look at how people copy the text over time. And so I think that already 500 years ago, people had a very good text of the New Testament. I think we can have a better one today because we have earlier manuscripts. And a key thing to point out is that when we have an edition of the New Testament, here I've got one I was involved in myself, Crossway at Cambridge University Press, the Tyndale Greek New Testament, is that it's not that this comes through a series of steps as if one person tells another, but people today go direct to the earliest manuscripts. They analyze them, they look at all of the different sources there are, and there is a basic convergence out of that as to what the text should be. So we find that when the Germans are editing in Munster and other people are editing, we're doing our own edition here in Tyndale House, that we're not differing that much in the decisions we're making based on the evidence there is.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about the first full collections of the Gospel coming from the 4th and 3rd centuries. And I think you talk particularly about the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and so on, which are P45, which are probably the best known. Tell us a little bit about those, where they came from, where they can be seen today, how much they vary from each other.
So Codex Sinaiticus is usually on display in the British Library, 5 minutes walks from King's Cross Station in London, and same with Codex Alexandrinus. Those are 4th and 5th century respectively, but parts of Sinaiticus, which comes from Mount Sinai, it may have been somewhere else before, but it's been in St. Catherine's Monastery. A few leaves are still in that monastery, a few are in Leipzig, a few in St. Petersburg, but they are all online. Same with Codex Alexandrinus. The British Library did manage to lose its high-resolution photos of that manuscript recently when its website was hacked, and they're still not back up. But thankfully, it's all been at least photographed in tolerable levels. And Chester Beatty, some of the papyrus is in Dublin, Ireland, some in Michigan. So you can go and check things out. But the great thing is that all of these manuscripts are available in digital images. Obviously, scholars like to have super good digital images, but even, the other ones, they're in good enough to be able to trace the letters.
So how many manuscripts are there altogether of the Gospels, or more broadly the New Testament, and how closely do they match each other?
Well, you often hear the number 5,000, 5,500, 6,000, but all of these numbers are bogus because it depends how you count. So one of the problems is that we have commentaries on the Bible,
Yeah.
And sometimes a commentary will quote the entire text. And it's rather arbitrary which commentaries get counted in the list, the official German list, the Liste of New Testament manuscripts, and which ones don't. So, but what I'd say is, broadly speaking, about 2,000 manuscripts for a gospel, the majority of which will be medieval. And there would be the fewest manuscripts of the book of Revelation. With Paul's epistles, you're going to have maybe 500 or 600. But again, it's less about how many manuscripts you have, because you could have one manuscript, and as you do for many classical works, and you would know that you had a reliable text.
Mm.
So having lots of manuscripts, in a sense, is very much surplus to requirements.
Yeah. So how do we know that the text hasn't been corrupted through transmission over time?
Yes. So people often frame it exactly as you did, with knowing a negative. How can we know that something hasn't been corrupted? And I would say it's like, how do you know that you weren't switched at birth, with another baby in the hospital, other than having done a DNA test? And I think there are things, rightly, that you presume to be the case. So the point is, with the Gospels, we've got, firstly, evidence that the material itself is from the 1st century. Someone in the 3rd or 4th century living in Turkey can't just make up that sort of stuff. They can't give you an accurate picture of pre-70 Judaism. So, but then you can also look and say, as we trace our manuscripts, we can see the sorts of changes that take place when people copy, and that doesn't lead us to the conclusion that the text is corrupted. So it's a bit like when an accountant goes in and audits a firm. You don't need to have read every single transaction of that firm to come to the view that it's reasonable to say that that there is no large-scale fraud in this firm. So I would say we certainly have lots of evidence to show us that the manuscripts are being well transmitted.
There are variations between some of the manuscripts. So question another way: how can we be sure that we can reconstruct the original text word for word? Yeah.
And obviously that varies, because if you look in a modern Bible, a New International Version or an English Standard Version or whichever, it will often have footnotes telling you other manuscripts do this.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's where the translators are often expressing to you some uncertainty. So you don't need to know everything to know something. Like, you might listen to a sermon and not hear part of it, but that doesn't mean you say, well, I didn't understand any of it. So I think there can be parts of the New Testament you might not be certain exactly what the wording is, but that doesn't vitiate the general view that these books come from God. Imagine you were having a conversation with St. Augustine in the 5th century, and he had a Latin manuscript in front of him, and you say, don't you know all the books copied by hand have some error? And he would say, of course I know that. But you then ask him the question, do you believe that God wrote the books without error? And he said, yes. So I think that we hold both that God gave completely true books, and that God is not under an obligation to give us copies of those books that have no copying errors in. But I would also say that these uncertainties are relatively minor. So we take the first verse of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and so on. Just about every manuscript agrees on exactly that. And so we know what it is, and the second verse the same, and the third verse the same, and so on. You go through, and we know exactly where the uncertainties are. So we get to John chapter 1 and verse 6, and there's a marginal uncertainty about whether John's name should be spelt with two N's or with one. I tend to the view that it's spelt with two N's, but there was one edition in the 19th century that put it with only one. Now, again, this is not something that upsets the message fundamentally of John's gospel. And we could go through to each of the sort of uncertainties that there are in John chapter 1. There's a little uncertainty in verse 18, a little uncertainty in verse 34, and I can go through them. We know them, and they're exact, they're precise, and everything else. There's no reason to doubt, if that makes sense.
So I guess the question often that people ask is, are there any variations which put into doubt any key historical fact or doctrine of Christianity?
I'd say no. I mean, I have here a textual commentary on the New Testament that's just come out by Professor Hugh Houghton from Birmingham University, and I also have the printouts of Dirk Jonken's textual commentary, and I'm going to go through and compare these two. And the great thing is, you can look up any particular verse, and for most verses there are no comments because there aren't really there's no variation to discuss. And so this is all very interesting when you read through and you get to Matthew's gospel, and the first variation is about the spelling of one of the names in verse 7 and 8 of chapter 1. And so there's a couple of spelling things it discusses in chapter 1. There really isn't that much uncertainty as you go through. So we have very known unknowns, if I can put it in that way.
Yeah. There's a couple of passages that people often bring up if you're discussing this.
Yeah.
Like at the beginning of John 8 and the end of Mark 16 that don't seem to be there in the earlier manuscripts. How would you respond to a question about that?
Yes, well, great. I mean, firstly, they're known unknowns and they're long-term known unknowns. So that is Erasmus 500 years ago knew that these were missing from some manuscripts. Yeah. And that's an interesting thing. And what we can say is as the number of manuscripts known has greatly increased, no new passages like this have come to light. So the one with the least manuscript support of those two passages is the one about the woman caught in adultery, last verse of John chapter 7 and the first 11 verses of chapter 8. And it's not in our earliest Greek manuscripts, as well as lots of other things it's not in. Yeah. With the end of Mark, the last 12 verses, traditionally numbered, it's not in our earliest two manuscripts of Mark. But I think a key thing to notice is that, again, this doesn't change the doctrines involved. It's significant, and that it also shows that Christians didn't make a bonfire of differing versions and say try to get rid of the evidence, and that's a really interesting thing. So we're not embarrassed about the fact that manuscripts have differences, and say with the end of Mark, you actually have quite a few different versions, because you have one where there's a shorter ending snuck in before the last 12 verses, somewhere there's just that shorter version with not the last 12, some without anything. You get different views on that. And what that again just shows us is the lack of censorship that was going on when these manuscripts are being produced, that people aren't suppressing the evidence. And that's really reassuring. Yeah.
Now, Peter, one name that's often associated with criticism in this area is Bart Ehrman. And one of our questions, Elliot Larson is asking, saying you've debated Bart Ehrman. How influential do you think his challenge has been? And perhaps outline for us what his point is. He's not a Christian believer, but he is a New Testament scholar.
Yeah.
and talks about variations. What's his basic point, and how would you respond to it?
Well, he's an agnostic. I, in fact, saw him last month, and he has just retired. So
Okay.
you can congratulate him on that. And I would say he's the world's most influential Bible skeptic. So, and he's got a sophisticated model of explaining away the Christian evidence. It requires a number of different steps, which, in a sense, I call them distance creators, create distance between Jesus and the Gospels. So, for instance, you put Jesus as an Aramaic-speaking peasant. The Gospels are in Greek and they're written late. He estimates the number of Christians at a very, very low number. So even in the year 100, he still thinks there are only about 10,000 Christians across the Roman Empire. So the smaller the number of people you get, the easier it is to get the information corrupted. He has the Gospels written outside the land. I mean, the Gospels are written more by elites than by peasants. And just the Mark comes first, and Q is in the way between that and Luke and Matthew, which are late, and John later still. And so he's got all of a sophisticated way of just creating distance between Jesus and the Gospels. I think each of those things individually is challengeable. But he's obviously a very persuasive person. He's a champion debater, very good at debating. I think he's worth taking seriously. But I do think you can also point out that there are some misunderstandings that he is promoting, in terms of he's reacting against a sort of teenage conception of Christianity.
Yeah.
For instance, he seems to argue that if you do not have a perfect version of the Gospels in front of you, you cannot have a doctrine of Scripture. This is a viewpoint that any church father would have found absolutely bizarre, because every single one of them knew about manuscripts and knew that they didn't have a perfect copy. Every monk in history has known that. But that hasn't stopped them believing that God gave books and that God gave exact words. So I think he often steps over from portraying himself as a historian to making sort of philosophical and theological points, which just don't make a lot of sense. So it's fascinating, but and of course he is very influential because he's translated into 30 different languages.
Yeah. So just coming back to the passages in John and Mark, and Rod McRory is asking here, do you regard disputed texts like Mark 16 or John 8 as authoritative? We often hear people preaching, especially from the woman caught in adultery, or does the fact that they weren't there in the earliest manuscripts undermine their reliability?
Yes, well, I mean, what would I do if I'm preaching on a passage and there is a word I don't understand?
Yeah.
Well, the key thing is I don't make that word central to my sermon. So I emphasize the things I'm most confident about. So that's what I think we should do when it comes to text. We emphasize most the things we are most confident about. Now, the church is spread around the globe, and there are some people who become Christians through Bible translations that use a traditional Textus Receptus based New Testament. So in Arabic, the Van Dyck translation uses that. Those translations often spread in Brazil, Romania, all sorts of places. And so they will come to faith in a context where, for them, the last 12 verses of Mark are unquestionable. Other people come to faith maybe through they're reading Christianity Explored, they're using the NIV, the very first Bible that they receive has a question mark about these last 12 verses. So they take it as a default that the last 12 verses are not part of the authentic text. So if you like, you've got different groups of Christians, and because of the way the world is getting evangelized is at least from a human perspective, chaotic, you get people new baby Christians being born on both sides of the divide. Well, a key thing is not to use our energy to attack each other. This is not very productive. I would say the most defensible academic position to take is that those two 12-verse passages are not part of the original text. They're not part of the inspired word of God, but I am not going to pick a fight with someone who wants to argue the opposite. I mean, I would lay out my reasons. I think that Mark ending at chapter 16, verse 8 works really well when it says they said no one to anyone because they were afraid, because I think that's a reference back to Genesis chapter 45, where when Joseph appears to his brothers back from the dead, they could not speak to him because they were afraid. And it's exactly the same sort of language you get in the Greek translation there, even ending a sentence with the same word gar. It's the same word that's used when sort of phrase when Sarah was afraid because God called her out for laughing in her head about miraculous life. So it's that sort of reference I find to Genesis there, and I think it works very well. I would say about the passage about the woman caught in adultery, I've written a book called, another plug, The Surprising Genius of Jesus, about just the amazing genius of Jesus' words. I would say the saying, let the one who has no sin throw the first stone, is genius. And it's not the sort of genius I see in apocryphal gospels, I've got to say. So being really honest, I would say that manuscript evidence, the external evidence, the early manuscripts lacking that passage makes me think it's not part of the original. The genius of that saying is the one thing that might make me reconsider. It's brilliant.
Yeah, no, great answer. Can we get on to contradictions in the gospel, or alleged contradictions, and perhaps to comment on a couple, that the two that come up most often, especially debating with Muslims, are around the genealogies in Matthew and Luke being different, Matthew 1, Luke 3.
Yeah.
And also around the resurrection appearances. You know, was it one angel or two, one man or two at the what was the order of people appearing and so on? Can you give us a quick answer to those?
Yeah, so on the genealogies, I mean, it's worth noting that it's surprising how similar the birth stories in Matthew and Luke are in their broad outline. They each have one set of visitors and only one set of visitors coming to Jesus. For one, it's the wise men in Matthew. In Luke, it's the shepherds. And there's almost like a contrast, as if some film director had planned to have the high and mighty and the lowly together, right? And then they've each got one genealogy. They've each got birth in Bethlehem. They've each got virgin birth. And what I'd say is, on a standard academic view of the Gospels, in which you have Q, Matthew and Luke write independently of each other. They don't know about each other, and yet they both write these birth stories which are surprising in their common features, let's say. The moment you allow that Matthew and Luke might know about each other, let's say Matthew comes first and Luke knows about the other, it automatically undermines the view that there is a fundamental contradiction, unless you're going to say that Luke wanted to contradict Matthew. Because really what it seemed is that whichever of the two of them wrote later was happy for his own narrative to stand alongside the other one. And that seems to me more likely. So fundamentally, they're not contradictory, and people down the history of the church have often not had a problem with them. There is an early, I think it's early third century correspondence, might be late second century, between Julius Africanus and so on the birth, the different genealogies and how they fit together. Because, of course, one of the questions is how can Joseph, Jesus' legal father, have two different fathers? According to Matthew, he's called Jacob or Jacob. According to Luke, he's called Eli or Haley.
Mhm.
Now, I have a biological father and I have a stepfather. Lots of people have different legal fathers from biological fathers, and particularly if you're in a honor shame culture and you say you're going to uh, um, marry someone who has a baby and you're not the father, uh, it's very easy to have your father disown you. So you could imagine easily the possibility of having Joseph having two fathers. And then you could also say, but there's an interesting thing. There's a phenomenon called paponymy, 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 where people name people after their grandparents. Notice that Jesus has a brother, half brother, called Jacobos. We translate it James in English. And that's interesting because that's really a version of the name Jacob. So actually, that gives you some circumstantial evidence that the name Jacob is real. Then you find that he's got another half brother called Joseph or Joseph. Well, that makes sense when he's named after his father. So these names make sense. And then when you go to the Matthew and Luke genealogies, you find that the great grandfather in Matthew is Matthan and in Luke is Matthat. And those are really two spellings of the same name. Now, I've written about this in Tyndale House's Ink magazine, which you can get freely online on the differences between the genealogies. So what I'd say is, I think there's good evidence that they can both be true and they don't have to contradict.
It's often says that one follows Joseph's genealogy and the other Mary's.
That is what is often said and was common in Reformation Bibles, where they would actually give you genealogies of family trees.
Yeah.
I would just say it's not explicitly said how Mary relates to the list of names in either gospel.
Yeah. So and finally, because sadly, Peter, we're running out of time. We've got more questions, but just finally, for a lot of non-Christians, particularly in a contemporary context, the miracles in the New Testament are a real barrier to belief. And you quote Carl Sagan in your book, who famously popularized the phrase, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." And we so often get this objection back, there's just not enough evidence. Would you just like to comment on the miraculous?
Yeah, so I mean, the word,
not just obviously the miracles of healing and walk on the water and so on, but particularly the resurrection, which is the cornerstone.
Yeah, the word extraordinary is a vague word, which needs pinning down. And of course, in materialist atheism, they are happy for something to come from nothing, for life to come from non-life, for consciousness to come from non-consciousness, and they do not feel they need to provide extraordinary evidence for this. Mm-hmm. They feel they just need to give us one possible scenario by which it might possibly have happened. Mm-hmm. So we've got to ask for a fair playing field. And the other thing is that your prior assumptions affect what you believe is extraordinary. So if you already believe in a miraculous God who made the universe, then having miracles occur is not so extraordinary or unexpected. The final thing I'd like to say about miracles generally philosophically is Christians don't believe in random miracles like fairies and pixies spoiling your experiments in your test tube. We believe that in the Bible and in life, miracles make signal patterns that point to Jesus. This is a key thing. They are not random. So the more you see the patterns cluster around Jesus, the amazing teaching, the amazing storyline, the death, the resurrection, it starts making sense. So with the resurrection, we're not asking people just to believe because a body disappeared and a ton of people said they saw Jesus risen from the dead. I think those are two amazing things together, but also that this happens to a remarkable person, first person to say, love your enemies, which is just the most amazing idea ever. Someone who has a royal genealogy, who dies on the eve of Passover time when Jews are celebrating their greatest deliverance, etc., etc. And you stack up all the remarkable things about Jesus, the most amazing storyteller, and you say it happened to that person. And it happened in the context of the remarkable preparation of the Old Testament, all of which points forward to that person. That's the package we're asking people to believe in. We're not asking them to investigate something paranormal that happened out in the middle of Utah. So that's a difference.
Absolutely. Well, sadly, we have run out of time. Peter, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your book and all that you do in the cause of the gospel.
Oh, thank you so much as well.
It's just been a pleasure to have you on the program today.
Well, thank you.
And thank you to all of you who've come along, submitted questions beforehand or during the program and listened. And we look forward to seeing you again soon on the interview webinars. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.